Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a fate that some consider an honor beyond measure, while others might whisper it to be a curse disguised as glory. To die in battle as a space marine is considered the greatest of ends, a warrior's death in service to the God Emperor of mankind. But what happens when death is denied? What becomes of those who fall in battle, their bodies shattered beyond repair, yet whose spirits burn too bright to be extinguished? They are given a second life, sealed within a walking tomb of adamantium and ceramite, transformed into something between man and machine, forever changed, yet forever serving. They become dreadnoughts, ancient warriors whose duty extends beyond the grave itself. Among the countless dreadnoughts that serve the Imperium, standing in the sacred halls of 1,000 chapters, there exists one whose story echoes through the centuries like a battle hymn that refuses to fade. His name is Tankred, and he serves the Black Templars, that most zealous of all Space Marine chapters. But Tankred was not always Tankred. Once, he was flesh and blood, a warrior who walked beneath open skies and felt the wind upon his face. Once, he had a different name, lived a different life, before iron became his flesh and eternity became his sentence. This is the story of transformation, of sacrifice, and of the terrible price that some warriors pay to continue their service to the Emperor. It is a story that spans centuries, crossing battlefields without number, facing enemies beyond counting. It is the story of how a savage boy from a primitive world became one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy, and how that warrior became something more and something less than human. It is the story of Tankred, the Ancient One, the Venerable, the Eternal. And it begins not in the cold depths of space, nor in the gleaming halls of a fortress monastery, but on a world of dust and blood, where survival was measured not in years, but in heartbeats. The Dreadnought stands as one of the most formidable weapons in a Space Marine chapter's arsenal. These towering war machines, standing twice the height of a man and bristling with weapons that could level buildings, are piloted by the chapter's greatest heroes. When a Space Marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology and the skills of the chapter's apothecaries cannot save them, they are given a choice, though it is rarely phrased as such. They can accept the Emperor's peace, their gene seed harvested to create future generations of warriors, their name inscribed in the chapter's halls of remembrance, or they can be entombed within the armored sarcophagus of a dreadnought, their broken body suspended in amniotic fluids, their nervous system hardwired into the machine's systems, living on as a weapon that thinks and a warrior who can no longer die. The process is excruciating beyond imagining. Neural interface plugs are driven directly into the spine and brain, bypassing organic sensory organs to connect directly with the machine's Auspex arrays and targeting systems. The warrior's lungs fill with thick, oil-like fluid that sustains them while simultaneously drowning them in an eternal moment. Their body, what remains of it, begins to atrophy almost immediately, our muscles withering away as the machine takes over every function. In time, little remains but a brain, a few vital organs, and the indomitable will of a space marine who refused to stop fighting even as death reached for them with eager hands. But more than the physical transformation, it is the psychological cost that weighs heaviest. A dreadnought pilot experiences the world through sensors and data feeds, not through eyes and ears. They feel through pressure readings and damage assessments, not through nerves and skin. The simple act of walking becomes a complex series of commands to hydraulic systems and servo motors. Every moment of existence is a constant battle against the machine's systems, a struggle to maintain the thin thread of humanity that connects them to who they once were. Is it any wonder, then, that most dreadnoughts spend the centuries between battles in deep stasis, their consciousness suspended in dreamless sleep, awakened only when the chapter faces its direst threats. Origins, from savage to soldier. The world of Kilhaven was not a place that bred soft men. Located on the fringes of Imperial space, it was a death world in all but official classification, a planet where survival required constant vigilance and strength of arm. The human population clung to existence in scattered tribal settlements, their technology crude by Imperial standards, their lives brutal and short. Among these tribes, the strongest ruled, and the weak perished before they could weaken the gene pool. It was a harsh existence, but it produced warriors of uncommon ferocity and resilience, exactly the kind of stock that Space Marine chapters sought when recruiting new aspirants. One such tribe was the Drumkill, a confederation of warriors who controlled a resource-rich territory in Kilhaven's temperate zone. They were not the largest tribe, nor the most numerous, but they were known for producing fighters of exceptional skill and courage. Among the Drumkill lived a boy named Racklaw, and from his earliest years, it was clear that he possessed something that set him apart from his fellows. He was quick, both in body and mind, able to assess a situation and act while others were still processing what they saw. He was strong, his muscles hardening early from the constant struggle for survival that defined life on Kilhaven. But more than these physical gifts, Racklaw possessed something harder to quantify. Something that the elders of his tribe recognized, but could not quite name. It was a quality that would later be identified as leadership. But in the context of Kilhaven's savage culture, it manifested as something else entirely. Racklaw did not simply fight for himself. When forced into the brutal arena combats that settled disputes between tribe members, he fought with a calculated precision that spoke of concern not just for victory, but for the broader implications of that victory. When hunting parties went out to bring back food or furs, he positioned himself to protect weaker members of the group, even at cost to his own safety. This was not softness, the elders understood. This was tactical thinking, the ability to see beyond the immediate moment to the longer game. The Black Templars came to Kilhaven on a recruitment drive, or as they had done periodically for generations. The chapter maintained a keep on a neighboring world and drew aspirants from several surrounding systems. Kilhaven, with its harsh environment and warrior culture, had always been a productive hunting ground for potential neophytes. But the Black Templars did not simply take volunteers or select promising youngsters through tests of skill. They had their own traditions, their own methods, and these methods were as brutal as the chapter itself. The Templars announced a trial, a contest of survival and skill, that would pit the strongest young warriors from each tribe against one another in a series of challenges. The survivors, if any proved worthy, would be taken to join the chapter. The fallen would earn honor for their families and tribes, their death serving a purpose higher than simple survival. For the tribes of Kilhaven, this was both opportunity and terror. To have a son taken by the Sky Warriors, as the Black Templars were known locally, was the highest honor a family could achieve. But the trials were designed to push candidates beyond their limits, to break them down and rebuild them, and many did not survive the process. Racklaw was selected to represent the Drumkill, chosen not just for his obvious physical gifts, but for that indefinable quality the elders had long recognized. He went to the trials with a mixture of excitement and dread, understanding that he was unlikely to return, regardless of the outcome. The trials themselves were a nightmare of endurance, combat, and tests designed to evaluate not just physical capability, but mental resilience and moral character. Candidates were pitted against one another in gladiatorial combat, not to the death, but certainly to incapacitation. They were forced to hunt alien creatures that had been imported specifically for the trials, beasts that could kill a grown man with contemptuous ease. They were subjected to psychological pressures designed to break their spirits and reveal their true natures under extreme duress. What set Racklaw apart? What ultimately brought him to the attention of the Black Templars' recruiting officers was not that he won every contest. He didn't. He was beaten, bloodied, pushed to the edge of death multiple times. But in every trial, even when facing defeat, He demonstrated qualities that the Templars valued above simple martial prowess. When forced to fight fellow candidates, he fought with honor, refusing to take advantages that would have been easy but dishonorable. When hunting the alien creatures, he worked to protect weaker candidates, even though the trials rewarded individual achievement. When subjected to psychological torture, he maintained his sense of self, refusing to compromise his values, even when it would have been easier to simply give the Templars what they wanted to hear. There came a moment during the trials that would be remembered by those who witnessed it. A moment that crystallized everything the Black Templars had been looking for. The candidates had been set against one another in what appeared to be a simple melee. Yes, the last fighter standing would earn points toward final selection, but it was a test within a test, designed to see how candidates behaved when given power over their fellows. Racklaw found himself paired against a warrior from a rival tribe, a young man he had known by reputation as cruel and brutal. The fight was one-sided, Racklaw's superior skill and training giving him a decisive advantage. Within moments, he had his opponent on the ground, helpless and at his mercy. The watching Templars expected Racklaw to deliver a coup de grace, to eliminate a rival and improve his own standing. Instead, Racklaw stepped back, allowing his opponent to rise. When the other warrior attacked again, Racklaw defended himself, but refused to press his advantage, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Finally, he did something that no candidate in the history of Killhaven trials had ever done. He turned to the watching Space Marines and spoke, his voice carrying across the arena. "This is not honor," he said, his words clear despite his exhaustion. "This is not what warriors do. We fight those who threaten us, who threaten our people. We do not kill one another for sport. I will not continue this." The arena fell silent. Such defiance, such refusal to follow the established rules, would normally result in immediate disqualification and probably death. But Brother Gerhard Brunner, the Black Templar responsible for overseeing this particular trial, saw something in that moment that transcended simple obedience. He saw a warrior who understood that true strength lay not in following orders blindly, but in adhering to a moral code, even when it came at personal cost. Brunner stepped into the arena, his massive armored form dwarfing the candidates. "You refuse the trial?" he asked, his voice amplified by his helmet's vox speakers. Racklaw stood straight, despite his injuries and exhaustion. "I refuse to kill my brothers for no purpose. If there is threat, if there is need, I will fight and die gladly, but this serves nothing." For a long moment, Brunner regarded the young warrior. Then he turned to his fellow Templars. "We have found one," he announced. "This one understands what it means to be a Black Templar. This one is worthy." And so Racklaw, savage warrior of the Drumkill tribe, became candidate number 88 in the Black Templars recruitment cycle. He would undergo the brutal transformation that would turn him from baseline human into Adeptus Astartes, a space marine, one of the Emperor's chosen warriors. But more than that, he would begin a journey that would span centuries, a journey that would take him from the dust of Killhaven to battles across the galaxy, and eventually to a fate that would preserve him long past his natural lifespan. The boy named Racklaw would die in those transformation chambers, burned away by genetic modification and psycho-conditioning. But from that death would emerge something new, a warrior who would eventually be known as Gerhard, and centuries later as Tankred. The Black Templars, Knights of the Eternal Crusade. To understand Tankred's story, one must first understand the Black Templars. For the chapter shaped him as surely as the genetic modifications that turned him from human into Space Marine. The Black Templars are unique among the 1,000 chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, marked by a zealotry and fervor that sets them apart even in a galaxy where religious devotion often manifests as genocidal fury. They are crusaders in the truest sense, knights errant who have waged an unending war against the enemies of humanity for over 10,000 years, never resting, never settling, always pushing forward into the darkness. The chapter's origins stretch back to the aftermath of the Horus heresy, that cataclysmic civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium of man in its infancy. When the traitorous War Master Horus led half the Space Marine legions in rebellion against the Emperor, the galaxy burned in the fires of betrayal and war. The conflict reached its climax on Terra itself, with the traitor forces besieging the Imperial Palace in an attempt to kill the Emperor and claim dominion over humanity. It was during this desperate defense that Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists Legion, appointed his first captain Sigismund as the Emperor's champion, granting him the finest armor and weapons and charging him with seeking out and destroying the champions of chaos in single combat. Sigismund embraced this role with a ferocity that became legendary. He walked the battlements of the Imperial Palace like an avatar of vengeance, challenging the greatest warriors of the traitor legions and defeating them one by one. His armor was painted black like the chaplains of the Reclusium, for he served the Emperor directly and answered to no other authority. His prowess became so feared that enemy champions began avoiding him, choosing to fight elsewhere rather than face the Emperor's wrath personified. When the heresy finally ended with Horus's death and the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, Sigismund's legend had been firmly established. But the heresy's end brought new conflicts. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, authored the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive tome that dictated how Space Marine chapters should be organized, trained, and deployed. Crucially, the Codex mandated that the old legions, which had numbered tens of thousands of warriors, be broken down into smaller chapters of roughly 1,000 Space Marines each. This was intended to prevent any single individual from ever again commanding the kind of military might that Horus had used to nearly destroy the Imperium. Guilliman saw it as a necessary safeguard against future traitors. Rogel Dawn disagreed vehemently. He saw the proposal as a betrayal of everything the legions had fought for, a suggestion that the loyal Primarchs could not be trusted. The disagreement escalated into a conflict that threatened to ignite another civil war, with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Vulcan of the Salamanders supporting Dawn's position, while Jagatai Khan of the White Scars and Korax of the Raven Guard sided with Guilliman. The Imperial Fists were even fired upon by the Imperial Navy, an act that came perilously close to forcing Dawn's hand. In the end, Dawn relented, her understanding that the Imperium could not survive another schism. But his acquiescence came with conditions and consequences. The Imperial Fists would be divided, creating several successor chapters. But the most zealous and aggressive of the Legion's warriors, those who chafed most at the idea of limitations and regulations, would not simply become another Codex-compliant chapter. Sigismund led these warriors in founding the Black Templars, and upon their departure from Terra, he swore an oath that would define the chapter for the next 10 millennia. Sigismund vowed that the Black Templars would never rest in their prosecution of the Emperor's enemies. They would wage an eternal crusade, taking the fight to the traitors, the aliens, and the heretics without pause or respite. They would not settle on a single homeworld. It would not build fortress monasteries where they could grow comfortable and complacent. Instead, they would live aboard their crusade fleets, establishing chapter keeps on worlds they conquered to serve as recruitment centers and staging areas, but never truly settling, never truly resting. Every High Marshal who has succeeded Sigismund has renewed this vow, making the Black Templars' crusade the longest Space Marine crusade in Imperial history. This eternal crusade has shaped every aspect of Black Templars' culture. Unlike most chapters, they do not strictly adhere to the Codex Astartes' recommended chapter strength of 1,000 warriors. The Black Templars are organized into multiple crusade fleets that operate semi-independently across the galaxy. Each crusade is led by a marshal, with the entire chapter nominally under the command of the High Marshal, though the practical realities of galactic distances mean that individual crusades often operate autonomously for years or even decades at a time. Some estimates suggest that if all the crusades were gathered in one place, the Black Templars would number several times the Codex prescribed limit. The chapter has been able to maintain this size because their distributed nature makes accurate counting difficult, and because their record of zealous service to the Emperor makes most inquisitors hesitant to question their practices too closely. The Black Templars' zealotry manifests in ways that distinguish them from their brother chapters. They are one of the few Space Marine chapters that openly acknowledge the Emperor's divinity, but viewing him not just as the founder of the Imperium and their genetic progenitor, but as a god worthy of worship. This puts them closer in philosophy to the ecclesiarchy and the imperial creed, followed by most imperial citizens, than to the secular warrior ethos of most Space Marines. Their faith is not the quiet, contemplative devotion of scholars or priests, however. It is a faith of action, of righteous fury, of absolute conviction that their cause is just and their victory assured, because they fight in the name of a god. This zealotry extends to their treatment of psychers, those unfortunate individuals born with the ability to manipulate the psychic energies of the warp. Most Space Marine chapters maintain librarians, psyker warriors, who use their abilities to support their battle brothers. The Black Templars refuse to do so, and viewing psychic power as inherently tainted and corrupting. They see witches as abominations to be destroyed, without exception or mercy. This makes them natural allies of the Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas, warrior women of the ecclesiarchy who share the Templars' religious fervor and hatred of the witch. The two forces often fight alongside one another, their combined zealotry creating a force that few enemies can withstand. The chapter also maintains the tradition of the Emperor's champion, dating back to Sigismund's appointment during the Siege of Terra. Before major battles, initiates of the chapter meditate and pray, seeking visions and guidance from the Emperor himself. Sometimes, one among them will experience a vision so powerful, so undeniable, that it marks them as chosen. These warriors are anointed by the chapter's chaplains and given ancient artifacts, the Black Sword and the Armor of Faith, transforming them into the Emperor's champion for that battle. The champion serves as the embodiment of the Emperor's will, seeking out and challenging the enemy's greatest warriors in single combat. To fight alongside an Emperor's champion is considered the highest honor, and his presence inspires Black Templars to feats of valor that exceed even their usual fearsome capabilities. The Black Templars' organization reflects their crusading nature. Rather than the rigid company structure used by Codex-compliant chapters, they fight in crusader squads, mixed formations that combine raw recruits called neophytes with experienced initiates and elite sword brethren veterans. This allows newer members to learn from veterans in the crucible of battle, while ensuring that squads have the flexibility to handle various tactical situations. A neophyte fights under the direct mentorship of an initiate, learning not just combat skills but the chapter's traditions, its history, and most importantly, its unwavering faith in the Emperor. Progression through the chapter's ranks is based on merit and achievement rather than time served. A neophyte who proves himself in battle can be elevated to initiate, at which point he takes on the responsibility of training a neophyte of his own. Initiates who demonstrate exceptional skill, courage, and devotion may be inducted into the marshal's household as sword brethren, the chapter's equivalent of veteran sergeants. These elite warriors are the only Black Templars permitted to wear Terminator armor, and they serve as the marshal's closest advisors and most trusted warriors. To become a sword brother is to have proven oneself beyond doubt, to have earned the respect and trust of the entire crusade. The chapter's fleet-based nature means that their battle barges and strike cruisers serve as mobile fortresses, equipped not just with weapons and training facilities, but with everything needed to sustain a Space Marine crusade indefinitely. The largest and most famous of these vessels is the Eternal Crusader, a Gloriana-class battle barge that serves as the High Marshal's flagship and the chapter's mobile fortress monastery. Originally gifted to Sigismund by Rogel Dawn himself, the Eternal Crusader has led Black Templars' crusades for 10,000 years. Its name, a constant reminder of the vow that Sigismund swore and that every Black Templar has renewed. This, then, is the chapter that shaped Racklaw, that would transform him from a savage youth into a crusading knight. The Black Templars are not merely soldiers or even warriors. They are zealots, true believers who fight with the absolute conviction that they serve a god and that their cause is the most righteous in the galaxy. They do not know doubt or hesitation. They do not know mercy or compromise. They know only faith, duty, and the eternal crusade that will not end until every enemy of mankind has been utterly destroyed. To become a Black Templar is to join a brotherhood that has been at war since before most Imperial citizens' ancestors were born, and will continue that war long after their descendants have turned to dust. It is to accept that your life, your death, and everything in between belongs not to you, but to the Emperor and the eternal mission he has set before humanity. The making of a warrior, from Racklaw to Gerhardt. The transformation of a baseline human into a space marine is one of the most horrific and miraculous processes in the Imperium. It begins with gene seed, genetic material harvested from the Primarchs themselves and cultivated through generations of space marines. This gene seed is implanted into the aspirant's body in a series of 19 separate organs, each one requiring invasive surgery and each one carrying the risk of rejection that could kill the candidate or transform them into a mindless, raving monster. The process takes years, with candidates subjected to hypno-conditioning that programs them with tactical knowledge, a chapter history, and unshakable loyalty while their bodies are rebuilt on a genetic level. For Racklaw, newly arrived aboard a Black Templar's strike cruiser, the transformation began almost immediately. He was taken to the chapter's apothecaries, those specialists who served as both physicians and genetic craftsmen. There, in surgeries that would have killed a normal human from shock alone, the first implants were inserted into his body. The secondary heart, the os modular that would strengthen his skeleton, the biscopea that would enhance his musculature. These and more were added to his physiology in procedures that left him in agony despite the pain suppressors used to keep candidates conscious enough to ensure the procedures were working correctly. Between surgeries, Racklaw underwent training that would have broken lesser men, while he was taught to use weapons he had never imagined. Bolt pistols that fired mass-reactive explosive rounds capable of blowing a man apart, chainswords with diamond-tipped teeth that could cut through armor and bone with equal ease. He learned tactics and strategy, the Black Templars filling his mind with knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of warfare. He studied the chapter's history, learning of Sigismund's first days and the eternal crusade that had followed. And through it all, he was subjected to the relentless psycho-conditioning that would forge his personality into that of a Black Templar, instilling him with the zealous faith and unshakable determination that defined the chapter. But more important than any of this was the relationship he formed with brother Gerhard Brunner, while the space marine who had selected him during the trials on Killhaven. Brunner served as Racklaw's mentor and instructor, the initiate responsible for transforming a savage youth into a warrior worthy of the chapter. In the Black Templars' tradition, this relationship was sacred. The initiate did not simply train the neophyte in martial skills. He shaped him, guided him, became the living embodiment of everything the neophyte aspired to become. Brunner was an experienced warrior, having served the chapter for nearly 2 centuries. He had fought in dozens of campaigns across multiple sectors, earning the respect of his brothers and the hatred of the Emperor's enemies. He was known for his tactical acumen and his unflinching courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But what made him an exceptional mentor was his understanding that a Black Templar was more than just a skilled killer. He needed to be a warrior with a moral compass, someone who could distinguish between necessary violence and needless cruelty, who understood that they fought not for glory or conquest, but for the protection of humanity and the prosecution of the Emperor's will. Racklaw's first test came sooner than he expected. His transformation was incomplete. only a handful of gene seed organs having taken root and begun their work when he was called to the training chambers. There, he found another neophyte, or what had once been a neophyte. The aspirant's body had rejected the gene seed implants catastrophically. His frame had been twisted by uncontrolled mutation, his mind shattered by the pain and the horror of his transformation. He had become a raving beast, more dangerous than any human, but lacking the control and discipline that made a space marine more than simply a large, strong creature. The task given to Racklaw was simple in its brutality: end the failed aspirant's suffering. It was both mercy and necessity. The creature could not be saved, could not be returned to humanity. Leaving it alive would be cruelty beyond measure, and it would pose a danger to everyone aboard the ship. Racklaw was given no weapons, only the chains that had been used to restrain the failed aspirant. The test was not whether he could kill, that was assumed. The test was whether he could do what needed to be done, without hesitation, without mercy, that would only prolong suffering.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because this part of Tankred's story really gets to me. When I first read about his transformation in the Damnation Crusade comics, I couldn't stop thinking about what that choice must have felt like. We often celebrate the Dreadnoughts as these badass walking tanks, and they absolutely are, but we rarely stop to consider the human cost behind that armor. Imagine being given that choice in your final moments: accept death or continue fighting but lose almost everything that makes you human. Your ability to feel the sun in your face, to taste food, to simply exist without being a weapon. And Gerhardt chose to continue. Whether that's noble or tragic, I honestly can't decide. Maybe it's both. But anyway, let's continue with his transformation.
And without becoming brutal in the process. The fight was brief, but savage. The failed aspirant attacked with mindless fury, all animal instinct and no strategy. Racklaw, despite his incomplete transformation, was faster and smarter. He used the very chains that had bound the creature against it, wrapping them around its neck and cutting off its air supply. It was not a clean death, or a quick one, but it was more merciful than allowing the creature to live in its twisted agony. When it was over, Racklaw stood over the body, trembling not from fear, but from the realization of what his life had become, what he had committed himself to. Brunner's voice came from behind him, calm and measured. "This is what we are," the Space Marine said. "We do what must be done, no matter the cost, but we do it with purpose. It's with understanding of why it is necessary. Remember this moment, neophyte. Remember that our calling is not cruelty for its own sake, but the willingness to bear the weight of hard choices so that others do not have to." Those words would stay with Racklaw throughout his transformation, through all the surgeries and conditioning that followed. They became a touchstone, a reminder of what separated a Black Templar from a mere killer. The transformation continued over the next several years. Racklaw grew larger, his frame expanding as the gene seed's modifications took hold. His bones became dense and nearly unbreakable. His muscles developed beyond human limits. Additional organs provided him with abilities that bordered on the miraculous. He could spit acid, his blood clotted almost instantly, and he could survive in environments that would kill baseline humans within seconds. His senses sharpened to superhuman levels. His reaction time decreased to the point where he could dodge bullets if he saw them coming. And through it all, the hypno-conditioning continued, filling his mind with tactical knowledge, historical records, and above all, unwavering faith in the Emperor. His first true combat deployment came against orcs, those brutal and cunning Xenos who spread across the galaxy like a green plague. The crusade Racklaw served in had responded to distress calls from an Imperial world on the verge of being overrun by a massive greenskin horde. The Black Templars made planetfall in drop pods, those one-way metal coffins that screamed through atmospheric entry to smash into the surface with bone-crushing force. For Racklaw, still a neophyte wearing lighter armor than his initiate brothers, the experience was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The battle itself was his first true test of everything he had learned. The orcs fought with savage enthusiasm, their numbers seemingly endless. They came in waves, screaming their brutal war cries, firing crude but effective weapons that could blow a man apart if they connected. Racklaw fought alongside Brunner, watching his mentor cut through the greenskins with a combination of martial skill and tactical awareness that seemed almost supernatural. Brunner moved like water, flowing around enemy attacks while his chainsword carved through green flesh and crude armor. He called out targets, directed Racklaw's fire, ensured that his neophyte stayed alive while still pushing him to the limits of his abilities. By battle's end, Racklaw had killed more than a dozen orcs, his bolt pistol and combat blade accounting for enemies that would have slaughtered entire squads of Imperial Guard. But more important than the kills was what he had learned. He understood now, in a way that training could never fully convey, what it meant to be a space marine. The absolute focus required to function in the chaos of combat. The trust you had to place in your brothers, knowing that they would cover your vulnerabilities while you covered theirs. The mixture of rage and control, allowing the fury to fuel your actions while never letting it dictate them. And above all, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that every enemy you killed was one less threat to the Imperium, one more step toward the completion of the Eternal Crusade. But it was on Hellespont, during the campaign against the Eldar, that Racklaw learned the cost of service. The Eldar were unlike any enemy he had faced before. Where the Orcs had been brutal and straightforward, the Eldar were precise and devastating. They moved with impossible grace, their weapons unleashing destruction with alien efficiency. The Black Templars were holding a strategic position when the Eldar assault came, led by a Wraithlord, a towering construct that contained the consciousness of a dead Eldar warrior piloting a war machine of terrifying power. Brunner stepped forward to meet the Wraithlord, his power armor and weapons seeming suddenly inadequate against the towering construct. The duel was brief and utterly one-sided. The Wraithlord's weapons fire tore through Brunner's armor, and then its massive limbs caught him in a grip that no amount of strength could break. Racklaw watched, helpless, as his mentor was torn literally in half, the upper and lower portions of his body separated with brutal efficiency. The Wraithlord tossed the pieces aside, like refuse, and continued its advance, only to be brought down by concentrated fire from the arriving reinforcements. Racklaw felt something break inside him in that moment. Not a physical wound, but something deeper. Brunner had been more than his mentor. He had been the example Racklaw was trying to live up to, the embodiment of everything a Black Templar should be. And now he was gone, killed so suddenly that there had been no time for final words or meaningful gestures. In the aftermath of the battle, as apothecaries harvested Brunner's gene seed so that it might be implanted in future generations, Racklaw stood vigil over his mentor's remains. The victory on Hellespont felt hollow, meaningless in the face of such loss, but the Black Templars did not allow time for extended mourning. A new initiate was assigned to complete Racklaw's training, brother Tova Skeld, a warrior nearly as experienced as Brunner had been. And life continued. More battles, more training, more conditioning. The years passed in a blur of combat and preparation for combat. Racklaw grew into his role, his skills sharpening with each engagement. He learned to anticipate enemy movements, to read battlefields with the tactical awareness that marked experienced warriors. He earned the respect of his battle brothers through actions rather than words, upproving himself again and again in the crucible of war. Finally, after 6 decades of service as a neophyte, far longer than was typical but necessary given the intensity of the campaigns he had fought in, Racklaw was deemed ready for elevation. In a ceremony attended by his Crusades marshal and overseen by the chaplains, he was formally recognized as an initiate. He was given the honor of choosing a new name, as was tradition for those reaching this rank. Without hesitation, he chose Gerhardt, taking his fallen mentor's first name as his own. It was both tribute and promise, a commitment to live up to the example that brother Gerhard Brunner had set. The newly christened Gerhardt knelt before his brothers, no longer a student, but a full warrior of the chapter. His armor was repainted, his oaths renewed, and he was given responsibility for training a neophyte of his own. He had entered the Black Templars as Racklaw, a savage from a death world who knew nothing of the galaxy beyond his tribe's territory. He emerged as Gerhardt, a warrior knight of the Eternal Crusade, ready to carry forward the mission that Sigismund had begun 10,000 years before. But his story was far from over. The decades ahead would test him in ways he could not imagine, would see him rise to heights of glory and fall to depths of despair. And eventually, those decades would lead him to a fate that would preserve him long past his natural lifespan, transforming him into something that was both more and less than the warrior he had become, the Sword Brother. Years of glory. As initiate Gerhardt, the warrior who had once been Racklaw, came into his own. As no longer a student learning the ways of war, he now stood as a full member of the Black Templars, a warrior knight of the Eternal Crusade with all the responsibilities and honors that entailed. The decades that followed saw him fight in campaigns across multiple sectors, facing enemies that ranged from the familiar brutality of orcs and the cold precision of necrons to the corrupting madness of chaos and the alien grace of the Elder. Each battle added to his experience. Each victory carved his name a little deeper into the chapter's records. Each loss reminded him of the price that warriors paid in service to the Emperor. But Gerhardt was not content with merely surviving and serving. He had inherited more than Brunner's name. He had inherited his mentor's understanding that a Black Templar must be more than a weapon. He must possess wisdom as well as skill, must lead as well as follow. He took his responsibility for training his assigned neophytes seriously, passing on not just martial techniques, but the philosophical underpinnings that separated a space marine from a mindless killer. He studied the chapter's extensive tactical libraries, absorbing lessons from battles fought millennia ago, learning from the mistakes and triumphs of warriors long since fallen. His career as an initiate was marked by a series of notable achievements. He earned commendations for his performance during the Garlant campaign, where his squad held a critical choke point against a tide of chaos cultists for 3 days with minimal support. He was personally recognized by Marshal Cornelius during the Succubi Gates engagement, where Black Templars fought against a Necron tomb complex that had awakened and threatened to consume an entire subsector. In that battle, Gerhardt led a desperate charge against Necron warriors, whose Gauss weaponry disintegrated any armor they struck. His tactical insight allowing his squad to exploit weaknesses in the Xenos formations that others had missed. But success brought its own challenges, particularly for someone of Gerhardt's temperament. He had always possessed a certain pride in his abilities, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. As his victories mounted and his reputation grew, this trait became more pronounced. He began to speak openly of his achievements, not out of malice or boastfulness, but from genuine satisfaction in what his squad had accomplished. He took pleasure in the chapter's recognition of his service, in the respect he earned from his brothers. And in doing so, he began to forget one of the fundamental truths that Brunner had tried to instill in him: that a Black Templar fought not for personal glory, but for the Emperor's will, that individual achievement meant nothing compared to the success of the crusade as a whole. His brothers noticed. They did not confront him directly. That was not the Black Templars' way. Instead, they gently tried to remind him of their shared purpose through subtle comments and careful guidance. They spoke of past warriors who had let pride cloud their judgment, of how the chapter's greatest heroes had always been those who understood that they were merely instruments of the Emperor's will. But Gerhardt, caught up in the thrill of recognition and the satisfaction of accomplishment, did not heed these warnings as he should have. He heard the words, but did not truly understand their weight, did not recognize that his brothers were trying to save him from a spiritual danger as real as any enemy he might face on the battlefield. The confrontation came during a quiet moment in the ship's chapel. Marshal Cornelius, commander of the crusade Gerhardt served in, called him to a private audience. The marshal was an ancient warrior, one who had earned his rank through centuries of service, and whose tactical genius was respected throughout the chapter. He was not given to unnecessary words or gentle handling of difficult topics. When Gerhardt entered the chapel, the marshal dismissed the attending chaplains and servitors, ensuring complete privacy for their conversation. Tell me, Gerhardt, the Marshal began without preamble. When you recount your victories to your brothers, whose glory do you celebrate? The question caught Gerhardt off guard. The chapter's glory, my lord. The success of our crusade. The Marshal's expression, visible without his helmet, showed disappointment rather than anger. No, brother. You speak of what your squad accomplished, what you personally achieved. You take satisfaction in the recognition of your peers. These are not the words of a warrior who has truly embraced our purpose. He gestured for Gerhardt to sit, a surprising informality that somehow made the conversation more intimidating rather than less. I do not criticize your skill, Cornelius continued. You are a formidable warrior, one of the finest initiates I have commanded. Your tactical awareness is exceptional, your courage unquestioned. Oh, but skill without proper perspective is dangerous. It leads to hubris, to making decisions based on what will enhance your reputation, rather than what will best serve the Emperor. We have lost too many good warriors to pride, Gerhardt. Do not force me to add you to that tally. The words struck Gerhardt like physical blows. He had been so focused on his achievements that he had not realized how far he had strayed from the ideals Brunner had tried to instill in him. He had been measuring his worth by the recognition of his brothers rather than by the completion of his duty. He had been fighting for validation rather than for the Emperor. I understand, my lord, Gerhardt said, and for the first time in years, he truly did understand. I have allowed pride to cloud my purpose. I will do better. The Marshal nodded, satisfied that his message had been received. See that you do. We have a campaign ahead that will test us all. I need warriors who remember why we fight, not those who fight for their own aggrandizement. The eternal crusade is larger than any of us, brother. Never forget that. Gerhardt took those words to heart. He sought out Chaplain Ecastus, one of the crusade's spiritual leaders, and confessed his failings. He performed penances, not because they were required, but because he needed to refocus his mind on what truly mattered. He changed how he spoke to his brothers, how he thought about his role in the chapter. When battles were won, he attributed success to the Emperor's will and his brothers' collective efforts. When his squad achieved something notable, he ensured that credit was shared among all who had contributed. The pride did not disappear entirely. Pride was part of what made a warrior strive for excellence, but it was tempered by humility and perspective. The transformation in Gerhardt was noted by his brothers. They saw him returning to the ideals of the chapter, saw him becoming the kind of warrior that Brunner had envisioned when he selected a savage youth named Racklau from Kilhaven's trials. And when Marshal Cornelius assembled his forces for what would prove to be one of the most challenging campaigns of Gerhardt's career, he specifically requested that Gerhardt's squad be part of the assault force. It was both recognition of Gerhardt's abilities and a test to see if he had truly internalized the lessons he needed to learn. The decades of service as an initiate also brought Gerhardt into contact with one of the chapter's most revered and mysterious elements, the Dreadnoughts. These ancient warriors, interred within armored sarcophagi after suffering wounds that should have killed them, were treated with a mixture of reverence and melancholy by their brothers. They were living links to the chapter's past, their memories extending back decades or even centuries, their tactical knowledge irreplaceable. But they were also reminders of the cost of service, of what could happen to even the greatest warriors. Gerhardt encountered his first dreadnought during a campaign briefing. The ancient war machine stood in the strategium, towering over the assembled space marines, its massive frame decorated with honor markings from countless battles. When it spoke, its voice was a mechanical rasp, filtered through voxcasters that turned organic speech into something artificial and cold. But the wisdom in those words was undeniable. The Dreadnought analyzed the tactical situation with a clarity that came from centuries of experience, pointing out weaknesses in the enemy's position that others had missed and suggesting approaches that proved devastatingly effective. After the briefing, Gerhardt approached the Dreadnought, curious about the warrior within. "Ancient One," he said, using the honorific traditionally given to Dreadnoughts. "How long have you served the chapter?" There was a pause. long enough that Gerhardt wondered if he had overstepped some boundary. Then the mechanical voice responded. 314 years since my interment, 200 years before that as a space marine. I have forgotten what it felt like to walk without servo motors, to breathe without amniotic fluid filling my lungs. But I remember my duty. I remember the eternal crusade. That is enough. The words haunted Gerhardt. He tried to imagine what it would be like to exist as the Dreadnought did, trapped within a metal shell, awakened only for battle, and then returned to stasis sleep for decades at a time. The thought was terrifying, not because of the physical transformation, but because of what it represented, an existence stripped of almost everything that made life meaningful, reduced to nothing but duty and service. He found himself grateful, in a way he had never been before, for the simple ability to feel the deck plates beneath his boots, to taste food, to sleep and dream and wake naturally. But he also came to understand something crucial about the Dreadnoughts. They were not tragic figures to be pitied. They were warriors who had made a choice, conscious or not, to continue serving even when death would have been a release. They embodied the ultimate expression of the Black Templars' ethos, the willingness to sacrifice everything, even one's humanity, for the completion of the Emperor's mission. They were, in their own way, the most dedicated members of the chapter because they had given up not just their lives but their deaths as well, condemned to exist in a twilight state between the two for as long as their war machine bodies could function. This understanding would prove crucial in the years ahead, though Gerhardt did not know it at the time. For now, he was simply a warrior in his prime, as a sword brother of the Black Templars, respected by his brothers and feared by the Emperor's enemies. He had overcome his pride, had learned the lessons that his mentors tried to teach him, had earned a place among the chapter's elite. The future seemed clear. More campaigns, more battles, more opportunities to serve. He could not know that within a few short years, everything he understood about his life and purpose would be stripped away, that he would face a choice no warrior should ever have to make, and that the path ahead would lead him to a transformation far more profound than the one that had changed him from Racklaw into Gerhardt. The Fall. Battle of Carrion Gulf. The assault on Magnum Christi should have been straightforward, at least by the standards of space marine warfare. The minor moon, little more than a large asteroid with an atmosphere, had fallen to Chaos forces during a rebellion in the sector. Intel suggested that the traitor forces were using Magnum Christi as a staging point for raids against Imperial shipping lanes. The Black Templars, responding to calls for assistance from local Imperial authorities, mobilized a strike force to eliminate the threat. Marshal Cornelius led the assault personally, with Gerhardt's squad among the Sword Brethren selected for the vanguard. The initial assault went well, almost too well. The Black Templars made landfall via drop pod, their characteristic brutal efficiency allowing them to secure a landing zone within minutes of touchdown. They began pressing into the fortifications that the traitor forces had established, expecting the kind of desperate but ultimately futile resistance that poorly organized chaos cultists typically offered. Gerhardt fought at the forefront, his decades of experience and hard-won wisdom making him a natural leader, even among the elite warriors of his squad. His squad cleared structures with methodical precision, his calls directing fire and coordinating movements that seemed almost choreographed despite the chaos of combat. But something was wrong. The enemy was falling back too easily, abandoning positions that could have been defended with minimal effort. They left behind weapons and equipment, even some vehicles that could have been used to slow the Black Templars' advance. It felt like a rout, like broken forces fleeing in panic. But Gerhardt's instincts, honed through decades of warfare, he screamed that this was something else. He voiced his concerns to Marshal Cornelius, suggesting that the enemy might be deliberately drawing them forward. The Marshal acknowledged the possibility, but determined that they had no choice but to press the advance. Allowing the traitors to maintain their foothold was unacceptable, regardless of what traps they might have prepared. The Black Templars advanced deeper into the moon's fortified sectors, clearing position after position with the same ease that had marked the initial assault. They were several kilometers from their landing zone, moving through what had once been a mining complex when they discovered why the enemy had been so eager to retreat. In a massive excavation chamber, lit by the dim glow of emergency lighting, stood two Chaos Titans. These god machines of war, they towering constructs that stood taller than buildings and bristled with weapons capable of leveling city blocks, had been buried here long ago. The traitor forces had not been using Magnum Christi as a raiding base. They had been excavating these ancient war engines, preparing to unleash them on the sector's defenders. The situation went from bad to catastrophic in seconds. The Titans, still being excavated but clearly functional, began powering up. Their weapons systems came online with the kind of apocalyptic fury that only god machines could command. At the same time, Chaos Space Marines emerged from concealment, traitor Astartes who had been lying in wait for exactly this moment. They had used their cultist allies as bait, drawing the Black Templars into a killing ground where the Titans could be used to maximum effect. What should have been a straightforward assault had become a nightmare scenario. A small force of Space Marines caught in close quarters with enemies they had no hope of defeating in conventional combat. Marshal Cornelius made the only decision he could. He ordered a fighting retreat, calling for reinforcements and extraction, while his forces attempted to break contact with the enemy. But the Chaos forces had planned well. They had positioned units to cut off the Black Templars' withdrawal routes, forcing the defenders into smaller pockets that could be eliminated individually. Gerhardt found his squad cut off from the main force, surrounded by traitor Marines, and with one of the Titans bearing down on their position like an oncoming avalanche. Brother Skeld, who had completed Gerhardt's training after Brunner's death, Paul was attempting to bring reinforcements through enemy positions, but was being delayed by fierce resistance. Communications were spotty, interference from the Titans awakening and deliberate jamming by the traitors, making coordination nearly impossible. Gerhardt understood with perfect clarity that his squad was not going to be rescued in time. They were going to have to fight their way out or die here, and the odds of the former seemed vanishingly small. But retreat was not in the Black Templars' vocabulary, not when there was still a chance to complete the mission. Gerhardt saw an opportunity, slim as it was. The Titans were not yet fully operational, their systems still booting up after millennia of dormancy. If he could reach the excavation machinery that surrounded them, he might be able to collapse part of the chamber, burying the god machines before they could be deployed. It would require getting past the Chaos Marines that guarded the approach, would require his squad to fight through enemies that outnumbered them significantly. And even if they succeeded, they would be trapped in the collapse they triggered. But it was a chance, however small, to ensure that these Titans would not devastate Imperial forces across the sector. Gerhardt made his decision in the fraction of a second that combat had trained him to operate in. He opened a channel to his squad. "Brothers, we go forward. The Titans must be stopped. If we fall here, we fall having completed our duty. There is no higher honor." His squad's responses were immediate and unquestioning. They were Black Templars. They did not fear death. They feared only failure to complete their duty. Yet they charged forward, bolt guns thundering, chainswords screaming, faith and fury driving them into the teeth of impossible odds. The fighting was beyond brutal. It was apocalyptic. Gerhardt's squad crashed into the Chaos Marines with the force of a thunderbolt, their momentum and surprise allowing them to break through the first line of defenders. But the traitors rallied quickly, their own enhanced physiology and combat experience making them formidable opponents. The battle devolved into a melee at close quarters, where bolt pistols fired at point-blank range and combat blades carved through power armor. Gerhardt fought like a man possessed, his blade finding gaps in enemy armor with the precision that came from decades of training, his bolt pistol accounting for enemy after enemy. But even as his squad pushed forward, her casualties mounted. Brother Aldrich took a plasma burst to the chest that melted through his armor and vaporized half his torso. Brother Matthias was dragged down by 3 traitor Marines, whose combined weight overwhelmed even his enhanced strength. One by one, Gerhardt's squad brothers fell, selling their lives dearly, but falling nonetheless. Soon, only Gerhardt himself remained, fighting alone against enemies that surrounded him on all sides, still pushing toward the excavation machinery that represented his only chance to complete the mission. He almost made it. Through sheer determination and skill that bordered on the supernatural, Gerhardt carved a path through the last of the defenders. His armor was scored and dented, leaking fluids from damaged systems. His left arm hung useless, broken by a blow from a Chaos Marine's power fist. Note he could taste blood in his mouth, where internal damage had caused bleeding that even his enhanced physiology couldn't immediately compensate for. But he was still moving, still fighting, still pushing forward toward his objective. It was a blow from behind that finally brought him down. A Chaos champion, one who had been hanging back to coordinate the defense, saw Gerhardt's approach and recognized the threat. The traitor's weapon, a massive two-handed power axe that crackled with corrupt energies, came down in an overhead strike that Gerhardt, focused on the enemies ahead of him, never saw coming. The axe bit deep into Gerhardt's lower back, severing his spine and crushing vertebrae that not even Space Marine bone density could fully protect. The blow drove him to his knees, his legs suddenly useless and unresponsive. The champion raised his axe for a killing blow, but at that moment, reinforcements finally arrived. Brother Skeld's force crashed into the traitors from an unexpected direction, the ferocity of their assault forcing the enemy to fall back or die. The champion was cut down before he could finish Gerhardt, his head separated from his body by Skeld's power sword. Within minutes, the chamber was cleared, the traitors killed or driven off. But for Gerhardt, the victory was hollow. He lay on the ground, unable to feel his legs, tasting blood, knowing with the certainty that comes from intimate understanding of combat that he was dying. The apothecaries worked on him there in the chamber, trying to stabilize injuries that should have killed him immediately. His spine was destroyed, his internal organs lacerated by bone fragments, his blood loss reaching critical levels despite his body's enhanced clotting factors. One of the apothecaries, Brother Cassius, looked at Marshal Cornelius and shook his head slightly. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, but Gerhardt saw it and understood its meaning. He was beyond saving, beyond repair. All that remained was to ease his passing and recover his gene seed so that it might be implanted in future generations. But Marshal Cornelius had a different idea. He knelt beside Gerhardt, his expression somber behind his helmet's faceplate. "Brother Gerhardt," the Marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of command and something else, something that might have been regret. "Your service has been exemplary, your courage undoubted. You have earned rest, earned the Emperor's peace, but I offer you a choice. Yes, if you have the strength to make it, we can end this here, honor your sacrifice and plant your gene seed, or we can preserve you, place you within a Dreadnought sarcophagus, allow you to continue serving the chapter as an ancient one. The choice is yours, but you must make it now. We have little time." Gerhardt's mind raced despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm consciousness. Become a Dreadnought, live on as a machine, continue fighting long after his natural lifespan should have ended. He thought of the Dreadnought he had spoken with years ago, of the mechanical voice speaking of forgotten sensations and remembered duty. He thought of Bruna, of all the brothers he had lost, of the eternal crusade that continued regardless of individual sacrifice. He thought of all the enemies still out there, all the threats to the Imperium that needed to be countered, and in the end, the choice was not really a choice at all. "Do it," Gerhardt whispered, blood flecking his lips. "The crusade continues. I continue with it." Marshal Cornelius nodded, respect clear in his posture even through the bulk of his armor. He gestured to the apothecaries who began preparations immediately. Gerhardt felt himself slipping away, consciousness fading as his injuries and blood loss finally overwhelmed even his enhanced physiology. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the Marshal's voice, reciting the litany that would be spoken over him as he underwent transformation. "We will not abandon such paragons to succumb to the ravages of mortality. The way will be prepared for him. He shall not be laid low, but raised high and exalted. He will join the Emperor's immortal retinue and walk the road of ages. He shall be taken from this place, and the armor of his past purpose removed. He shall be healed, anointed with sacred oils, unguents, and balms. The incantations of installation will be intoned, and the litanies of preservation given voice. The machine spirits will be summoned to invest the almighty host with their motive aspect, and he will be dressed in furious glory, to war forevermore in the Emperor's name. Gerhardt, who had been Racklaw, who had served the Black Templars for nearly a century, who had earned the respect of his brothers and the hatred of the Emperor's enemies, slipped into darkness. But it was not the final darkness. It was merely transition, a passage from one form of existence to another. When he woke, and if waking was even the right word for what would happen, he would no longer be Gerhardt. He would be something new, something ancient, something that existed between life and death. He would be Tankred, and his war was far from over. In fact, in a very real sense, it was only just beginning. Rebirth in iron, becoming Tankred. The process of transforming a space marine into a dreadnought is one of the most complex and delicate procedures in the Imperium. It requires not just the surgical skill of the chapter's apothecaries, but the technical expertise of the tech marines, those space marines who have studied under the Adeptus Mechanicus and learned the sacred rites of maintaining the chapter's most precious war gear. It also requires the cooperation of the machine spirit that inhabits every dreadnought chassis, as that fragment of sentience that some claim is merely sophisticated programming while others insist is something more, something that borders on true consciousness. For Gerhardt, the procedure began immediately after his evacuation from Magnum Christi. The apothecaries kept him alive through methods that would have killed a baseline human from shock alone, pumping him full of chemicals to maintain basic organ function while they removed what remained of his shattered armor. They worked with desperate speed, knowing that even Space Marine physiology had limits, that every moment Gerhardt remained in his current state brought him closer to irrevocable death. His spine was destroyed, his legs useless, multiple organs failing. In a sense, he was already dead, maintained in a state of artificial life by the apothecary's skills. The tech marines prepared the dreadnought sarcophagus, an armored coffin that would become Gerhardt's new body. They performed rituals passed down through 10,000 years of tradition, anointing the sarcophagus with sacred oils, inscribing prayers in High Gothic across its surface, appealing to the machine spirit within to accept the new pilot who would be placed within its care. These rituals were not mere superstition. The dreadnought chassis was ancient, its systems a blend of technology and something else, something that the tech marines called the machine spirit and treated with a reverence that bordered on worship. If that spirit rejected the new pilot, the process would fail, and Gerhardt would die despite all their efforts. The actual installation took days. Gerhardt's body was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. What remained of his limbs was removed, unnecessary flesh that would only complicate his new existence. His torso was opened, and the cybernetic systems that would sustain him were implanted directly into his major organs. His spine, already destroyed, was replaced with a neural interface column that would connect his nervous system to the dreadnought's systems. His skull was fitted with ports that would allow his brain to interface directly with the machine's sensory arrays. Throughout all of this, he floated in and out of consciousness, experiencing fragments of the procedure through veils of pain that even Space Marine pain tolerances could barely withstand. But the physical transformation was only part of the process. The psychological aspect was, if anything, even more challenging. As the cybernetic systems came online, Gerhardt experienced sensations that his brain had no framework for processing. He could feel the dreadnought's weapon systems as extensions of his body, massive autocannons and power fists that responded to his thoughts, as if they were his own limbs. He could see through Auspex arrays that provided far more visual information than human eyes, overlaying tactical data and target acquisition markers across his field of vision. He could hear Vox communications from across the ship simultaneously, his enhanced processing capability allowing him to filter and prioritize information that would have overwhelmed a baseline human. And through it all, he could feel the machine spirit, an alien presence in his mind that was both part of him and separate from him. It was not hostile exactly, but it was not entirely welcoming either. But the machine spirit had its own imperatives, its own way of interpreting the world. It wanted to fight, to protect, to serve, but it also wanted to rest, to be left alone in the darkness between battles. Gerhardt found himself in a constant dialogue with this presence, negotiating with it, trying to forge a working relationship that would allow both man and machine to function as one. When the procedure was finally complete, when all the systems had been installed and tested and deemed functional, Gerhardt was sealed within the sarcophagus. Amniotic fluid flooded the chamber, filling his lungs with a thick, cold liquid that his modified respiratory system was now designed to process. Neural interface cables stabbed into the ports in his spine and skull, connecting him fully to the Dreadnought chassis. For a moment, he panicked, the sensation of drowning triggering responses that bypassed conscious thought. But the tech marines had anticipated this, and sedatives flooded his system, forcing him into unconsciousness before the panic could cause him to damage himself or the delicate systems that now sustained him. He woke some time later, though he had no sense of how much time had passed. Days? Weeks? Without external sensory input, without the ability to feel his body or see his surroundings, time became meaningless. He tried to move and felt nothing, no response from limbs that no longer existed. He tried to speak and heard nothing, his vocal cords severed or removed during the procedure. For a terrible moment, he wondered if the procedure had failed, if he was trapped in some kind of limbo between life and death, conscious but cut off from the world. Then, slowly, systems began coming online. Visual input flickered into existence, grainy and distorted at first, but gradually resolving into coherent images. He could see the chamber he was in, though the perspective was wrong, higher than it should have been, and with overlaid data that his brain struggled to interpret. Audio input followed, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, mechanical and distorted. He tried to process what he was hearing, tried to make sense of the sensory information that flooded his consciousness. And then he heard a voice he recognized, calm and measured, speaking directly to him through what he realized was a Vox channel. "Brother Tankred, can you hear me?" The voice belonged to Tech Marine Arnulf, one of the specialists who had performed his transformation. The name Tankred caught him off guard. Oh, that was not his name. His name was Gerhardt. But then he understood. Dreadnoughts took new names when they were interred, a tradition that dated back to the chapter's founding. Gerhardt had died on Magnum Christi. What lived now was something new, something that carried Gerhardt's memories and personality, but was no longer quite the same warrior. Tankred. The name felt strange, alien, but he supposed he would get used to it eventually. "Tankred sleeps," he said, or tried to say. What came out was a mechanical approximation of his voice, synthesized by the Dreadnought's voxcasters from the signals his brain sent. The sound was harsh and artificial, bearing only a passing resemblance to the voice he remembered having. "I know," Arnulf replied, his voice gentle, despite the distortion of the Vox system. "But you cannot sleep any longer. We need you to wake fully, to help us calibrate your systems." The process of adjustment took weeks. Tankred had to relearn everything that had once been instinctive. How to walk, coordinating servos and hydraulics rather than muscles and joints. How to manipulate objects, using massive power fists rather than hands with individual fingers. How to process sensory input that came from machines rather than organic eyes and ears. The Tech Marines were patient, walking him through each system, each capability. But there were frustrations that nearly drove him to madness. The constant sensation of drowning in the amniotic fluid. The inability to feel pain or pleasure, or any physical sensation beyond damage reports and system warnings. The mechanical voice that spoke when he tried to communicate, stripping away inflection and emotion. The constant presence of the machine's spirit, its needs and desires a background noise in his consciousness that never fully went away. But gradually, painfully, Tankred learned to function in his new form. He learned to interpret the Dreadnought's sensory arrays, to understand the data overlays that appeared in his vision. He learned to control his movements with the precision that combat would require. He learned to work with the machine spirit rather than fighting against it, understanding that man and machine would need to function as one if he was going to survive. And slowly, very slowly, he came to accept what he had become. He was no longer Gerhardt, the sword brother who had fought with blade and bolter. He was Tankred, Ancient One, a walking weapon that carried the memories and experience of decades of warfare. At his first deployment came sooner than he expected. The Crusade needed him, needed the firepower and durability that a Dreadnought could provide. Tech Marine Arnulf oversaw his activation, speaking the ritual prayers that awakened both man and machine. When Tankred's consciousness fully engaged, when he took control of the Dreadnought's systems and raised himself from the maintenance cradle, he felt something he had not expected to feel again. Purpose. He was still a warrior. He could still serve. The form had changed, the method had changed, but the mission remained the same. The Eternal Crusade continued, and Tankred would continue with it. As he stomped toward the deployment bay, his massive frame shaking the deck plates with each step, his weapons systems coming online and his tactical systems analyzing potential threats, as Tankred understood something fundamental about his new existence. He had been given a gift and a curse in equal measure. The gift was continued service, the ability to keep fighting for the Emperor, and the chapter long after his natural lifespan should have ended. The curse was the price of that service, the loss of nearly everything that made him human, the reduction of his existence to nothing but warfare and the brief moments of consciousness between battles. Whether that trade was worth it, he could not yet say, but he had made his choice, and there was no going back now. All that remained was to see where the path ahead would lead him, what the centuries would make of the warrior who had been Racklaw, who had become Gerhardt, and who now walked as Tankred, Ancient One of the Black Templars, forever bound to the Eternal Crusade. In the ancient warrior, centuries of battle time move strangely for a Dreadnought. Between deployments they sleep in stasis, their consciousness suspended in a state that is neither true sleep nor true waking. Days can pass like seconds, years like minutes. The warrior within the metal shell exists in fragments, moments of wakefulness separated by vast gulfs of time that vanish into nothingness. For Tankred, the first century of his new existence passed in what felt like a blur of battles, interspersed with periods of nothingness, each awakening bringing new faces, new enemies, new campaigns, and always the creeping realization that time was leaving him behind while he remained locked in an eternal present. His first major engagement as Tankred came against the Tau, as those philosophically advanced Xenos who spoke of the greater good while expanding their empire at humanity's expense. The campaign, known as the Kasseroth Offensive, saw Black Templars forces deploying against a Tau expansion fleet that had established footholds on several Imperial worlds. Tankred was awakened from his first extended period of stasis to serve as heavy fire support for the assault on a Tau fortification that conventional forces had failed to breach. Tech Marine Arnulf presided over his awakening, as he would for decades to come. The process was neither quick nor pleasant. Tankred's consciousness had to be gradually brought back from the suspended state it occupied in stasis, systems activated one by one to avoid shocking his physiology. Even with all precautions, the transition was excruciating. His brain, as starved for input during stasis, struggled to process the flood of sensory data as his systems came online. The amniotic fluid in his sarcophagus, which had been still and silent, began circulating again, the sensation triggering responses that his conscious mind had to override. And always, there was the machine spirit, rousing from its own dormancy. Its presence in his consciousness like a second self that he had to negotiate with to achieve full functionality. The actual waking followed a ritual that Tankred would come to know intimately over the centuries. The banging of servo skulls against his sarcophagus, mechanical alarm bells designed to penetrate even deep stasis. Arnulf's voice, calm and measured, speaking his name through the Vox system. "Brother Tankred, can you hear me?" And Tankred's now familiar response, as mechanical and harsh, "Tankred sleeps." It was not defiance exactly, it was simply the truth. Part of him, perhaps the largest part, wanted nothing more than to remain in the darkness, to avoid the sensory overload and the psychological weight of waking to find yet more time had passed. Yet more of the world he remembered had changed. But duty required waking, and so he did. The battle against the Tau was Tankred's first true test of his capabilities. The Tau fought with precision and technology that rivaled even Imperial standards, their weapons guided by advanced targeting systems, and their tactics adapted in real time by command algorithms. They deployed battlesuits, powered armor systems piloted by individual warriors that could match a space marine in combat capability, if not in raw durability. When Tankred entered the battlefield, as a Tau commander in a crisis battlesuit engaged him directly, rail rifle shots hammering into his armor with devastating force, the fight was brief but instructive. The Tau commander was skilled and brave, fighting with a tactical awareness that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. The battlesuit's weapons were powerful enough to damage Tankred's armor, burning through ceramite and scoring the adamantium framework beneath. But in the end, the Tau warrior was facing a target that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of engagement. Tankred's assault cannon, a rotary weapon system mounted on his arm, spoke with thunderous authority, each shell exploding against the battlesuit's shields until they collapsed, and then tearing into the armor itself. When the commander tried to jet away, as to use mobility to escape an enemy he could not defeat directly, Tankred's targeting systems tracked the movement with mechanical precision. A sustained burst from the assault cannon brought the battlesuit down, its pilot's courage insufficient to overcome the raw firepower advantage that Tankred possessed. But victory came with a cost. Tankred's armor had been damaged, not critically, but enough to require repair. And more than the physical damage, there was the psychological impact. Fighting in this new form was nothing like the combat he remembered. There was no adrenaline surge, no racing hearts or quickened breathing. There was only tactical calculation, target acquisition, optimal firing solutions. The machine systems filtered out emotion, leaving only efficiency. It should have been satisfying, this cold precision. Instead, it felt empty, hollow, as if he was watching someone else fight rather than participating himself. After the battle, as Tech Marine servitors worked to repair his damage, Tankred experienced another unsettling realization. He could not simply power down and rest. The repairs required his systems to remain active, his consciousness engaged, because the machine's spirit would not cooperate with repairs if the pilot was dormant. This meant hours of enforced wakefulness, during which he had nothing to do but think, to remember, to contemplate what he had become. The servitors prepared sedatives to return him to stasis once repairs were complete, chemical agents that would ease him back into the dreamless dark. But Tankred found himself resisting. "Tankred hears your noise," he vocalized, the mechanical voice carrying frustration that the Vox speakers could not fully express. Your loud noise woke Tankred. Tankred has had enough sleep. Tankred wishes to speak to Arnulf of previous battles and times. There was a long pause as the servitors consulted with their Tech Marine overseers. Then Arnulf himself appeared, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "The pain of remaining conscious is significant," he noted. "We can ease you back to rest." But Tankred refused. For hours he spoke with Arnulf, or as much as his mechanical voice and limited vocabulary allowed, discussing battles past, asking about the Crusade's progress, trying desperately to maintain some connection to the world beyond his metal shell. Eventually the pain became too much. Even Tankred's enhanced resilience had limits. And the strain of remaining conscious during repairs exceeded those limits. Arnulf administered the sedatives with a gentleness that Tankred appreciated more than he could express. As his consciousness faded, returning to the void of stasis, Tankred's last coherent thought was a simple one. He was more alone now than he had ever been in his life, and that loneliness was going to be his constant companion for as long as his war machine body functioned. The next awakening came over 2 centuries later, though for Tankred it felt like he had closed his eyes only moments before. But the passage of time became immediately apparent. Tech Marine Arnulf was gone. In his place stood Pyramus, younger and less familiar, introducing himself as Arnulf's successor. "It has been over 2 centuries since you last walked, Ancient One," Pyramus explained, and his voice carrying a reverence that Tankred found simultaneously gratifying and disturbing. He was being treated like a relic, a piece of history rather than a warrior. But then, he supposed that was what he had become. The reason for his awakening was dire. A demon prince of chaos had emerged in the sector, a warp-spawned monstrosity that had destroyed multiple Imperial forces sent against it. The entity was powerful beyond mortal comprehension, reality itself bending around it as warp energies leaked through its presence. Conventional forces could not stand against it. Even Space Marines had fallen before its power. The Black Templars needed their heaviest assets, and that included Tankred. This time, his awakening was rushed, the niceties of gradual system activation abandoned in favor of immediate deployment, and stimulants were injected directly into his amniotic fluid, shocking his system back to consciousness with brutal efficiency. His protests, "Tankred sleeps, Tankred hears your noise," were met with apologies, but no delay. The crusade needed him now, and there was no time for gentle awakening. The mission briefing was delivered as he was being prepared for deployment, Tech Marine Pyramus explaining the situation while servitors performed final checks on his weapons and armor. The Demon Prince had manifested on a world called Carrion Gulf, the same world where Gerhardt had made his last stand, though Tankred had no memory of that event. The symbolic resonance was lost on him, but the tactical situation was clear. He would be deployed alongside several squads of Black Templars, his firepower providing the kind of overwhelming force necessary to bring down a warp entity of this magnitude. The battle against the Demon Prince would prove to be the defining moment of Tankred's existence as a Dreadnought, the moment when he truly understood what he had become and what price he would continue to pay for his continued service. But that understanding would come through pain and near destruction, through a confrontation with an enemy that represented everything the Black Templars fought against, and through a choice that Tankred would have to make about whether continued existence in this form was truly worth the cost. The war was far from over, and Tankred, whether he wanted to be or not, was still very much part of it. Confronting darkness, the Demon Prince. The world of Carrion Gulf was a monument to chaos corruption. What had once been an Imperial shrine world, its surface covered with magnificent cathedrals and monuments to the Emperor's glory, had been transformed into a nightmare landscape. The architecture remained, but it had been twisted, warped by the influence of the warp. Holy symbols had been defaced or replaced with blasphemous sigils. Statues of saints had been corrupted into obscene mockeries. The very air seemed thick with malevolence, as if reality itself recoiled from what this place had become. Tankred's deployment came via orbital insertion, his massive frame secured in a specialized drop pod designed to survive atmospheric entry despite the tremendous weight of a Dreadnought chassis. The descent was violent even by Space Marine standards, his systems registering G-forces that would have crushed a baseline human, but Tankred barely registered the physical stress. His consciousness was focused on the mission parameters, on the tactical data flowing through his neural links, on preparing for the battle that awaited him on the surface. Impact came with bone-jarring force, the drop pod's shock absorbers cushioning the landing but not eliminating it. The pod's doors blew outward explosively, and Tankred stepped out onto the corrupted soil of Carrion Gulf. His weapons systems came online immediately. targeting reticules appearing in his vision as his Auspex arrays scanned for threats. He was not alone. Several squads of Black Templars had deployed alongside him, their distinctive black armor marked with white crosses standing out against the dark purple sky. Marshal Helbrecht, commander of this particular crusade, and one of the chapter's most respected leaders, approached Tankred's position. The Marshal was a formidable warrior in his own right, his armor bearing the scars of countless battles, his presence radiating the absolute confidence that came from centuries of successful command. "Ancient One," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the Vox channel. "The target is in the central cathedral. Our scouts report that it has fortified the position with cultist forces and traitor Astartes. Your firepower will be essential in breaching their defenses." Tankred's mechanical voice responded with the kind of straightforward acknowledgement that had become his standard communication style. Tankred understands. Where Tankred goes, the enemy falls. Let us begin." The advance toward the central cathedral took hours, the Black Templars fighting through corrupted cityscape against enemies that seemed to pour from every structure. Cultists, baseline humans whose minds had been twisted by exposure to chaos, attacked in waves, their faith in the dark gods making them fearless to the point of suicidal. But cultists, however numerous or fanatical, posed no real threat to Space Marines, much less to a Dreadnought. The real resistance came when they reached the outer perimeter of the cathedral. Chaos Space Marines, traitor Astartes, wearing corrupted versions of power armor, opened fire from fortified positions. Their weapons, blessed or cursed depending on one's perspective by the dark gods they served, struck with devastating effect. Bolt rounds enhanced with warp energies detonated against Tankred's armor with force that exceeded their normal specifications. Plasma weapons left glowing scars in his ceramite plating. And through it all, the traitors fought with a coordination and skill that matched that of the Black Templars they opposed. But Tankred had been designed for exactly this kind of engagement. His assault cannon spoke its thunderous message, each burst of fire tearing through the traitors' cover and armor with equal efficiency. His power fist, crackling with disruptive energy fields, crushed any enemy foolish enough to attempt close combat. He advanced like a walking fortress, his massive frame absorbing damage that would have destroyed vehicles while his weapons carved a path through the enemy defenses. Behind him, the Black Templars pressed forward, using the openings he created to eliminate resistance and secure positions. The cathedral's main doors stood before them, massive slabs of corrupted stone that had been sealed and reinforced. Tankred did not slow his advance. His power fist smashed into the doors with the force of a meteor impact, shattering stone and warping metal. A second blow created an opening large enough for Space Marines to pass through. The Black Templars poured into the cathedral, and Tankred followed, his bulk barely fitting through the entrance he had created. Inside, the full scope of the corruption became apparent. The cathedral's interior had been transformed into a throne room for the Demon Prince. The entity sat upon a dais that had once held a statue of the Emperor, its form simultaneously magnificent and revolting. It was huge, is easily twice the size of a Dreadnought, its body a blend of armor and corrupted flesh that shifted and changed even as Tankred's optical systems tried to focus on it. Wings of tattered leather stretched from its back, claws like swords tipped its hands, and from it radiated power, raw warp energy that made reality itself bend and flex in its presence. When it spoke, its voice was not a single sound, but a chorus, as if multiple beings were speaking in unison. "So the corpse worshippers send their broken toys to face me. How delightful." The words carried power beyond their meaning, reality rippling with each syllable. Several of the Black Templars staggered, their ceramite armor suddenly feeling inadequate, their faith tested by the presence of something that should not exist. But Tankred felt nothing. The demon's psychic assault, and designed to inspire terror and despair, had no purchase on his mechanical systems. He was immune not through strength of faith or will, but simply because he was too machine to be affected. "Target acquired," Tankred's mechanical voice announced, his weapon systems locking onto the demon prince. "Commencing engagement." His assault cannon roared to life, shells crossing the distance between him and the entity in fractions of a second. But the demon was not bound by normal physical laws. It moved with impossible speed, its massive frame blurring as it dodged some shots and absorbed others with casual disdain. Warp energy crackled around it, deflecting or disintegrating incoming fire. And then it laughed, the sound carrying mockery and malice in equal measure. "You cannot hurt me, machine thing," the demon prince declared, its voice carrying absolute confidence. "I am eternal. I am power incarnate. What can your pathetic weapons do against the might of the gods?" As if to prove its point, the entity gestured, and reality itself seemed to twist. The cathedral's floor buckled and warped. Gravity reversed in localized areas, sending cultists and even some Chaos Marines tumbling through the air. The Black Templars fought to maintain their footing, to keep their formations intact in the face of impossible phenomena. But Tankred advanced, his massive weight and mechanical stability allowing him to maintain traction even as the ground beneath him tried to betray him. His assault cannon continued firing, each burst forcing the demon to expend energy on defense, to divide its attention. And where his shots connected, they did damage. The demon might be powerful, it might be nearly immortal, but it was not truly invulnerable. Tankred's weapons, blessed by the chapter's chaplains and maintained by tech marines who understood their sacred nature, could hurt even warp entities if they connected. The demon prince recognized the threat. It launched itself forward with speed that defied its size, closing the distance between itself and Tankred in seconds. Its claws, each one long enough to run a space marine through, struck Tankred's armor with the force of siege weapons. Ceramite cracked and buckled. Adamantium framework bent under the impact. Warning indicators flooded Tankred's sensory input, his systems screaming alerts about structural damage and compromised integrity. But he did not falter. His power fist came up in a defensive movement that was part instinct and part tactical calculation. The fist caught one of the demon's claws, the power field around it disrupting the warp energies that gave the entity its form. For a moment, the two were locked together, demon and Dreadnought, one representing the corruption of chaos, and the other the steadfast service of the Imperium. And in that moment, Tankred understood something crucial. The demon was powerful, yes, but it was also overconfident, too certain of its superiority to properly respect the threat that a properly armed and determined opponent represented. Using the demon's own momentum against it, Tankred pivoted, a movement that should have been impossible for something of his size and weight, but which his enhanced servo systems and the machine spirit's cooperation made possible. The demon stumbled, its balance disrupted, and in that fraction of a second of vulnerability, Tankred struck. His assault cannon, pressed directly against the entity's torso, fired at point-blank range. The shells, their warheads designed to penetrate the thickest armor before detonating, punched through the demon's warp-spawned flesh and exploded inside its body. The demon prince screamed, a sound that transcended mere audio, that resonated through the warp itself. It lashed out wildly, its claws tearing chunks from Tankred's armor, its power shattering servos and damaging internal systems. Tankred's left arm, the one mounting his assault cannon, was torn from its mounting with a wrenching scream of tortured metal. His power fist, locked around the demon's claw, was crushed by warp energy that made the very laws of physics optional suggestions rather than rigid rules. But even as his body was being destroyed around him, even as warning indicators turned his vision red with critical damage alerts, Tankred did not stop fighting. With the barrel of his severed assault cannon, he stabbed upward, driving the jagged metal into the demon's thigh like an improvised spear. The entity recoiled, ichor rather than blood flowing from the wound, and in that moment of distraction, Tankred activated the storm bolter mounted beneath his right arm. The The weapon was designed for anti-infantry work, not for killing demon princes. But at this range, with the entity already wounded and its attention divided, it was enough. The bolter round stitched a pattern across the demon's head and upper torso, each explosive shell adding to the cumulative damage. The entity's regeneration, its ability to reshape its form and heal wounds through pure warp energy, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of damage being inflicted. And then, with a final scream that shattered every remaining piece of glass in the cathedral, the demon prince's form destabilized. The warp energies that had sustained it in the material realm could no longer maintain cohesion. With a thunderclap of displaced air, the entity was banished, sent howling back into the Imperium from which it had emerged. Tankred stood among the wreckage of the battle, his form barely recognizable as a dreadnought. His left arm was completely gone, torn away at the shoulder mounting. His right arm was functional, but barely, the power fist crushed, and the storm bolter out of ammunition. His armor was cracked and scored across every surface, while whole sections of ceramite plating missing entirely. Internal damage indicators suggested that multiple systems were failing or had already failed. By any reasonable standard, he should have been inoperative, should have collapsed into a heap of broken metal and dying flesh. But Tankred remained standing. Through force of will, through the determination that had been forged in him first as Raklor, then as Gerhard, and now as Tankred, he stayed conscious and operational. As Techmarine Pyramus rushed forward to assess the damage, as apothecaries prepared to put him into emergency stasis before his life support systems failed completely, Tankred's damaged Vox speakers crackled to life one more time. "Tankred endures," he said, his mechanical voice even more distorted than usual, parts of the vocalization system clearly failing. Tankred endures. And then, finally, he allowed himself to slip into darkness, into the emergency shutdown that would preserve what remained of his consciousness while his body was repaired. He had won, had completed his mission, had proven that even a demon prince could be defeated by sufficient determination and firepower. But the cost had been enormous, and as his consciousness faded, Tankred wondered if victory was truly worth the price he had paid, and would continue to pay for as long as his war machine body could be maintained. The cost of immortality, a dreadnaught's existence. The repairs took months. Tankred's sarcophagus, the armored womb that contained what remained of his organic body, had been compromised but not breached. His life support systems, redundant and over-engineered precisely for situations like this, as had maintained his vital functions, even as the chassis around him was shredded, but the dreadnought itself was nearly a total loss. The frame was bent and twisted, requiring complete replacement. The weapon mounts had been torn from their housings and would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Power conduits had been severed, armor plates destroyed, servo systems crushed beyond repair. During the repair process, Tankred remained conscious for longer than was typical. The Techmarines needed his input to properly calibrate new systems, to ensure that the rebuilt dreadnought would respond to his control as efficiently as the original had. This meant weeks of enforced wakefulness, during which Tankred had nothing to do but think, to remember, to contemplate his existence. And it was during this extended period of consciousness that he truly began to understand the cost of his continued service. Techmarine Pyramus visited regularly, overseeing the work, and speaking with Tankred about matters both tactical and personal. During one such visit, Tankred asked a question that he had been avoiding since his awakening. "Pyramus, how long has it been since I was interred? Not since my last awakening, but since I became what I am." Pyramus consulted a data slate before responding. 273 standard years, Ancient One. You were placed within your sarcophagus during the Carrion Gulf campaign, and you have since served in 17 major engagements across 14 different war zones. Your combat record is exemplary. 273 years. Tankred tried to process that number, while to understand what it meant. When he had been Gerhard, he had served for less than a century before his injuries. In the time since his transformation into a dreadnought, nearly 3 times that span had passed. Everyone he had known, everyone who had been his battle brother during his time as Gerhard, was long since dead. The chapter had recruited, trained, and lost multiple generations of space marines in the time he had spent locked in stasis between battles. He was no longer a warrior of the Black Templars. He was a relic, a piece of living history that most of the chapter's current members had never known in any other form. "Who knows me?" Tankred asked, his mechanical voice carrying a weight that surprised even him. "Who among the chapter remembers Gerhardt? Who recalls the warrior I was before this?" Pyramus's response was gentle, while tinged with regret. "Very few, Ancient One. Brother Skeld, who served as your final initiate when you were Gerhardt, still lives. He is a marshal now, commanding his own crusade. He speaks of you with great reverence, says that your sacrifice inspired him to greater service. But beyond him, there are few. Most of the chapter knows you only as Tankred, the Ancient One who has served for centuries." The revelation should not have been surprising. Tankred had known, intellectually, that time was passing while he slept. But hearing it confirmed, understanding that he was disconnected from even his own chapter's recent history, brought home the reality of his existence in a way that abstract knowledge never could. He was alone in a way that few beings in the galaxy could understand. His past was dead and buried. His present was fragments of consciousness scattered across centuries. And his future was nothing but an endless repetition of the same cycle. Wake, fight, sleep, repeat. But the psychological isolation was not the only cost of his existence. There was also the physical degradation, slow and subtle but inexorable. Tankred's organic body, what remained of it within the sarcophagus, was atrophying. His muscles, never used, had withered to almost nothing. His bones, no longer stressed by the forces of normal movement, were becoming brittle despite the mineral supplements that the life support systems provided. His lungs, constantly filled with amniotic fluid, no longer truly functioned as lungs, their tissue degrading as the mechanical respirator took over their function completely. Piece by piece, cell by cell, and the organic components that made him Tankred were dying, replaced by mechanical systems that performed the same functions but lacked any semblance of living tissue. The apothecaries monitoring his biological functions assured him that this was normal, that Dreadnought pilots typically lost most of their organic body mass over extended service periods. They could maintain his brain and vital organs almost indefinitely, they said. But even as they offered these assurances, Tankred could hear the unspoken caveat. Almost did not mean forever. Eventually, the degradation would reach a point where even the apothecary's skills could not compensate. Eventually, the organic spark that made him more than just a machine would gutter and die. And when that happened, whether in decades or centuries, Tankred would finally find the peace that had been denied to him for so long. But perhaps the most insidious cost was the gradual erosion of his humanity in ways that were harder to quantify. During his extended wakefulness, Tankred tried to remember his life before the sarcophagus. He could recall events, battles fought, and brothers lost. He could remember tactics and strategies, lessons learned through hard experience. But the emotional context of those memories was fading. He remembered that Brother Brunner had been important to him, remembered that the mentor's death had impacted him deeply. But he could no longer recall exactly how it had felt, could not summon the grief or anger or sense of loss that he knew he must have experienced at the time. It was like looking at images of someone else's life. Events that he knew intellectually had happened to him, but which he could no longer truly connect with emotionally. The machine spirit, that alien presence in his consciousness, was slowly overwhelming the human elements of his personality. Where once he had negotiated with it, had maintained a distinct sense of self separate from the machine, now the boundaries were blurring. He caught himself thinking in terms of optimal firing solutions and tactical efficiency, rather than in the more fluid, intuitive way that humans normally processed information. He evaluated situations based on damage assessments and threat calculations rather than instinct and experience. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he found that he did not particularly mind this transformation. The mechanical thinking was efficient, clean, uncomplicated by emotion or doubt, and it made decision-making straightforward. reducing complex situations to simple calculations of risk versus reward, threat versus capability. It was easier to function as a weapon that could think than to try to maintain the illusion that he was still a human warrior wearing armor. The armor had become him, or perhaps he had become the armor. The distinction was increasingly meaningless. During one conversation with Pyramus, Tankred tried to articulate this concern. "I am losing myself," he said, his mechanical voice struggling to convey the complexity of what he was experiencing. "The memories remain, but the person who made those memories is fading. Soon, there will be nothing left but the machine and a ghost that thinks it is still human. Is this normal? Is this what happens to all dreadnoughts?" Pyramus was silent for a long moment before responding. "Yes, Ancient One, it is normal. The oldest of our dreadnoughts, those who have served for millennia, report similar experiences. The humanity fades, replaced by something else. Some call it transcendence, the shedding of weakness to become pure purpose. Others call it a kind of death, a slow dissolution of the self until nothing remains but duty. Which it is, I cannot say. But you are not alone in this experience. Every dreadnought walks this path eventually." The knowledge that his experience was common did not make it more comforting. If anything, it made the future seem even bleaker. He was not unique, not special, not an exception to the rule. He was simply one more warrior who had chosen continued service over the mercy of death, and who would pay the price for that choice until either his body or his machine finally failed completely. The eternal crusade would continue regardless of whether Tankred was part of it or not. He was not indispensable, not irreplaceable, merely useful so long as his weapons could fire and his frame could move. But despite all of this, despite the isolation and the degradation and the slow erosion of everything that made him human, Tankred did not regret his choice. When given the option between death and transformation, he had chosen to continue fighting, and that choice, at least, remained valid. The enemies of the Emperor were still out there, still threatening humanity, still needing to be destroyed. And while Tankred could still fight, while his weapons could still speak, and his frame could still move, he would continue to serve. It was not because he expected reward or recognition, not because he believed his service would make a significant difference in the grand scheme of the galaxy, but simply because it was what he was, what he had chosen to become. "Tankred endures," he had said after defeating the Demon Prince. Those words had become more than just a statement of fact. They had become his defining philosophy, his reason for existence. Regardless of cost, regardless of degradation, regardless of the slow erosion of his humanity, Tankred would endure. He would continue fighting until his machine body finally failed, until his organic systems could no longer be maintained, until the light of consciousness finally gutted out and left nothing but a dead shell of metal and ceramite. And in that endurance, and in that refusal to quit, despite everything that tried to break him, there was a kind of defiant nobility that even he could recognize. Legacy of the Eternal, Tankred's impact. For the brothers of the Black Templars who served alongside Tankred, his presence on the battlefield was both inspiration and reminder. Inspiration because he embodied the chapter's most cherished ideals: absolute dedication to duty, unwavering faith in the Emperor, and the willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of the eternal crusade. But also reminder of the terrible price that such dedication could extract, of what awaited those who fell in battle but whose service was deemed too valuable to end with death. Young Space Marines, neophytes barely initiated into the chapter's mysteries, then would see Tankred stomping across the battlefield and feel both awe and unease in equal measure. The stories of Tankred's past had entered the chapter's oral tradition, passed down from veteran to recruit during training sessions and quiet moments aboard the Crusade fleets. They spoke of Raklaw, the savage youth who had refused to kill his fellow candidates and had been selected for that very refusal. They recounted Gerhardt's rise through the chapter's ranks, his struggles with pride, and his eventual wisdom. They described the last stand on Magnum Christi, where a sword brother had held against impossible odds and made the choice to continue serving even in death. And they honored Tankred, the Ancient One who had fought for centuries and who still stood ready whenever the crusade called. But the reality of Tankred was more complex than the legends allowed. Those who had served alongside him multiple times, across decades or even centuries of warfare, understood that the Ancient One was not the hero of legend. He was a warrior slowly losing his humanity, fighting not for glory, but from a simple inability to stop. His terse communications, his mechanical precision, his lack of emotional display, these were not marks of stoic resolve, but symptoms of his gradual transformation into something more machine than man. The younger brothers saw only the legends. The older ones saw the cost. Brother Tova Skeld, now marshal of his own crusade, visited Tankred whenever their forces operated in proximity. Skeld had been one of the last space marines to know Gerhardt before his transformation, while had served as his initiate during those final years before Carrion Gulf. He remembered Gerhardt as a mentor who had taught him not just how to fight, but why they fought, who had demonstrated through example what it meant to be a Black Templar. Seeing what Gerhardt had become was both honor and heartbreak. During one such visit, after a successful campaign against Orc raiders, Skeld stood before Tankred's sarcophagus in the maintenance bay, where the Ancient One was being prepared for stasis. "Brother," Skeld said, his voice carrying the weight of decades and the respect due to one who had trained him. "Do you remember when we fought together on Hellespont? When you told me that a warrior's strength was measured not in kills, but in the lives he protected?" Tankred's optical sensors focused on Skeld, his damaged Vox speakers crackling as he formed a response. "Tankred remembers Hellespont. Elder. Wraithlord killed Brunner. Tactical data suggests you were present during that engagement as reinforcement element. Specific conversations. Difficult to recall. Time. Memory. Fading." The mechanical voice, stripped of emotion and hesitant in its delivery, was almost painful for Skeld to hear. This was not Gerhardt speaking. This was something else, something that wore Gerhardt's memories like ill-fitting clothes. "I wanted you to know," Skeld continued, his own voice tightening with emotion that his conditioning tried to suppress, "that those lessons stayed with me. I have used them to train 3 generations of neophytes, passed them on as you passed them to me. Your wisdom serves the chapter still, brother. Gerhardt serves the chapter still. Even if he does not remember all that he taught." There was a long pause before Tankred responded. "Gerhardt is dead. Gerhardt died on Magnum Christi. Tankred remains. Tankred serves. The eternal crusade continues." The words should have been cold, dismissive. But Skeld, who had known Gerhardt well, heard something else in them. Not resignation exactly, but acceptance. Tankred understood what he had become, understood what he had lost, and had made peace with that loss in his own way. For the chapter's tech marines, Tankred represented both triumph and challenge. He was one of their oldest functioning dreadnoughts, a testament to their skill in maintaining these ancient war machines. But he was also wearing out, his systems showing the strain of centuries of combat and activation cycles. Tech Marine Paramas spent more time maintaining Tankred than any 3 other dreadnoughts combined, constantly updating systems, replacing components that had degraded beyond acceptable parameters, performing the ritual prayers that ensured the machine spirit's cooperation. "He is dying," Pyramus confided to one of his subordinate tech marines during a particularly involved repair session. "Slowly, perhaps taking another century or more, but dying nonetheless. The organic components are degrading faster than we can compensate for, and the machine spirit grows stronger, more dominant. There will come a point where the distinction between Tankred and the machine becomes meaningless, where we are maintaining a weapon system that happens to contain fragments of human consciousness, rather than a warrior who uses a machine as his body." But despite this grim assessment, Pyramus continued his work with dedication that bordered on reverence. Tankred deserved that much, deserved to have his service honored through meticulous care and attention. Every hour that the tech marines could extend his operational life was another hour that the chapter benefited from his experience and firepower. And if they were merely delaying the inevitable, merely postponing the moment when Tankred's organic spark would finally gutter out. Was that not their duty regardless? The Emperor's servants did not give up simply because victory seemed impossible. For the chapter's chaplains, those spiritual leaders who tended to the Black Templars' souls as the apothecaries tended to their bodies, Tankred was a theological puzzle. He still served the Emperor, still fought the enemies of humanity, still embodied the chapter's ideals of duty and sacrifice. But did he still possess a soul? Had the transformation into a dreadnought stripped away the divine spark that separated living beings from mere automata? The chaplains debated this question in private, never reaching a consensus. Reclusiarch Mordred, one of the most senior chaplains in the chapter, visited Tankred periodically to speak with him about matters of faith. These conversations were often one-sided, Tankred's responses brief and mechanical, but Mordred persisted. "Tell me, Ancient One," he asked during one such visit, "when you fight, do you feel the Emperor's presence? Do you know, in your core, that you serve a higher purpose?" Tankred's response was characteristically terse. "Tankred fights because enemies exist. Enemies threaten the Imperium. Tankred eliminates threats. Purpose is clear. Emperor's presence, uncertain. Memories of faith remain. But faith itself? Harder to define. The machine does not feel. The man fades. What remains serves, even if service is no longer motivated by faith, but simply by inability to do otherwise." Mordred found that answer both troubling and somehow appropriate. A dreadnought was not supposed to be a normal warrior. Perhaps the loss of normal faith, the reduction of service to pure functionality, was itself a kind of transformation, a apotheosis into something beyond human concerns like belief and doubt. Or perhaps it was simply tragedy, the slow death of a soul trapped in a machine that would not let it rest. He could not say, and perhaps in the end, it did not matter. Tankred still served, and that was what the chapter needed. But Tankred's legacy extended beyond just the Black Templars. Other chapters, hearing of the Ancient One who had served for centuries, sent representatives to observe him in battle, to learn from his tactical expertise, to understand how the Black Templars maintained such veteran assets. Tankred became, in a sense, famous beyond his own chapter, a figure whose reputation spread across the Imperium's military forces. He was cited in tactical treatises, used as an example in training programs, discussed in the halls of the Adeptus Mechanicus as a particularly successful example of man-machine integration. None of this fame touched Tankred himself. He did not seek glory, did not care about recognition beyond his chapter. He fought because that was what he was built for, what he had been created to do. The universe beyond his targeting reticules and mission parameters had ceased to have meaning for him. He was a weapon that could think, nothing more and nothing less. And if that reduction of existence to pure function was tragic, if it represented a kind of death in life, he was no longer capable of experiencing that tragedy in any meaningful way. Tankred endures, he had said, and would continue to say whenever asked about his service or his state of being. Those words summed up everything about his existence. He was not living, not in any meaningful sense. He was enduring, persisting, continuing from one moment to the next through sheer momentum and inability to do otherwise. And in that endurance, in that stubborn refusal to simply cease despite every reason to do so, there was a lesson for every Black Templar who witnessed it. The eternal crusade demanded everything. It took youth and age, flesh and spirit, past and future. But it gave purpose in return, and for some, that purpose was worth any price. Conclusion. The Endless Vigil. The tale of Tankred, Ancient One of the Black Templars, is not one of triumph or tragedy alone. It is both and neither, a story that defies simple categorization because it spans the boundary between life and death, between man and machine, between individuality and function. Tankred endures, as he has said and will continue to say, but that endurance is not mere survival. And it is something more complex, more nuanced, more human, despite the mechanical form that expresses it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, stories like Tankred's are common enough to be unremarkable, yet rare enough to be revered. Thousands of dreadnoughts serve across the thousands of Space Marine chapters that defend humanity's shrinking borders. Each one is a warrior who refused death, who chose to continue fighting even after their body had failed them. Each one pays the same price that Tankred pays, surrendering their humanity piece by piece, memory by memory, until all that remains is purpose without personality, duty without desire, service without self. But Tankred's story matters precisely because it is so common. He was not a Primarch or a chapter master, but he was not gifted with powers beyond those of normal Space Marines. He was simply a warrior who served well, who made hard choices, who lived by the ideals of his chapter even when those ideals demanded everything he had, and more. And in doing so, he became something that transcends individual achievement, something that embodies the eternal nature of the crusade that the Black Templars wage. The boy named Racklaw died centuries ago, burned away by the transformation into a Space Marine. The warrior named Gerhardt died on Magnum Christi, his body too broken to continue in its original form. What remains is Tankred, neither truly alive nor fully dead, existing in a twilight state between the two. He has fought in battles without number against enemies without count. He has served the Emperor for spans of time that exceed the entire lifetimes of most Imperial citizens, and he will continue to serve until his machine body finally fails or his organic components degrade beyond even the Adeptus Mechanicus's ability to maintain. When that end comes, whether in decades or centuries, Tankred will finally find the rest that has been denied him for so long. His sarcophagus will be interred in the chapter's halls of remembrance, his name added to the long list of ancient ones who served and fell. The Black Templars will honor him with ceremony and prayer, acknowledging his sacrifice and his dedication. And then the eternal crusade will continue, because it must, because it has for 10,000 years, and will for 10,000 more, regardless of which individual warriors fall along the way. But until that end comes, Tankred stands ready. In the maintenance bays of Black Templars' battle barges, his form waits in stasis, systems dormant but prepared to activate at a moment's notice. When the call comes, when the crusade needs the firepower and durability that only a dreadnought can provide, the Tech Marines will begin the ritual of awakening. The banging of servo skulls, the voice calling his name, the gradual activation of systems that have slept for years or decades. And Tankred will respond as he always has, with reluctance born of long experience, but also with readiness born of deeper purpose. Tankred sleeps, he will say, because part of him, the part that remembers being Gerhardt and perhaps even being Racklaw, wants nothing more than to remain in the darkness. But duty will call louder than desire for rest. And he will wake, his weapons will come online, his targeting systems will acquire threats, and he will stomp forth once more to meet the enemies of the Emperor and the Imperium. Because that is what he was made for, what he chose to become, what he remains despite everything that has been stripped away. For those who would follow the path of the Space Marine, who would serve the Emperor and defend humanity against the darkness that presses in from all sides, Tankred's story offers both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because he demonstrates what dedication truly means, what it looks like to sacrifice not just your life, but your death as well in pursuit of a cause greater than yourself. Warning because he demonstrates the cost of such sacrifice, as the slow erosion of everything that makes you who you are until service is all that remains. Is that cost worth paying? Tankred can no longer answer that question in any meaningful way. The warrior who made the choice to undergo transformation is too far removed from the machine that carries his memories for the question to have relevance. But perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps the cost is not meant to be weighed against benefit, measured, and found acceptable or unacceptable. Perhaps the cost is simply what service demands, and those who serve truly do not count that cost, because counting would suggest that there might be circumstances under which they would refuse to pay. The Black Templars have crusaded for 10,000 years without rest or respite. They have fought in battles without number on worlds without count. They have lost brothers beyond measure, their gene seed harvested and implanted in new recruits who will carry on the tradition. And through all of this, through 10 millennia of unending war, warriors like Tankred have stood ready. Ancient ones who remember battles fought before their battle brothers' grandparents were born, who carry the tactical wisdom of centuries, who embody the chapter's unwavering dedication to its sworn mission. When the Emperor's children or the Death Guard assault an Imperial world, when orc hordes mass for war or tyrannid hive fleets descend from the void, when Necrons awaken from their tombs or Chaos cultists threaten to tear reality asunder, it is warriors like Tankred who stand ready to meet them. Not because they expect reward or recognition, and not because they believe their individual contribution will be decisive, but because that is what they are, what they have chosen to become, what they will remain until the very end. Even in death, I still serve. Those words, engraved on countless Dreadnought sarcophagi, on memorial stones, on the armor of space marines across the galaxy, sum up the commitment that warriors like Tankred have made. Death is not an end to their service. It is merely a transition, a change of form, but not of purpose. And so they fight on, these ancient warriors, these living weapons, these reminders of what the Imperium demands from its defenders. If you found value in learning about Tankred's story, about the price and purpose of service in the grim darkness of the far future, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you choose if given the option between death and eternal service? Could you endure as Tankred endures, or would the cost prove too high? These are questions without easy answers, but they are worth contemplating as we explore the rich and tragic tapestry of the Warhammer 40k universe. Remember, the Eternal Crusade continues, whether or not any individual warrior is there to see it. But for those who choose to stand and fight, to serve until they can serve no more, there is a kind of immortality available. Not the immortality of gods or demons, not the false promise of chaos, or the mechanical certainty of the Necrons, but the immortality of purpose, of becoming something larger than yourself, and of adding your voice to a chorus that has been singing for 10,000 years and will sing for 10,000 more. Tankred endures. The Black Templars endure. The Imperium endures. And in that endurance, in that stubborn refusal to give up despite everything that suggests surrender would be easier, there is something approaching grace. It may not be a life that anyone would choose freely, but it is a life, or something like a life, that has meaning. And in the grim darkness of the far future, meaning might be the most precious resource of all. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect you all in whatever crusades you face.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.